Hello, my name is Vanessa Seifert, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the MetaScience project in the University of Bristol. This is my talk for the joint session of the Aristotelian Society, and I'd like to thank the Aristotelian Society for this opportunity, as well as my colleagues at the MetaScience team. And I'd also like to thank Anna Gretu, James Ladyman, and Nikos Stylianou for some helpful discussions I've had with them on this topic. So today I'm going to talk about a very popular topic in the philosophy of science, which is the topic of inter-theory relations. How do scientific theories relate to each other? And how are the entities posited by those theories related to each other as well? Now, I'm not going to discuss a particular view within this debate. I would rather pursue a meta-philosophical analysis by looking at the persistent disagreement that exists about this topic. Specifically, there is significant consensus within the scientific community about a large part of scientific theories. Yet when it comes to understanding how these theories relate, there are many different and highly divergent views. And this is surprising, because if there is agreement on a large part of our scientific theories, regardless of whether that agreement is actually correct, there shouldn't be such controversy on how these theories relate to each other. And of course, this is not a new worry, and philosophical disagreement has been discussed more generally before. So, for example, Van Inwagen states that disagreement in philosophy is pervasive and irresolvable. There is almost no thesis about which philosophers agree, and that is not how things are in the physical sciences. There is in physics a large body of settled, usable, uncontroversial theory, and of measurements known to be accurate within limits that have been specified. So this has been discussed before, but today I wish to examine philosophical disagreement from the point of view of inter-theory relations. And indeed, when it comes to the literature of inter-theory relations, one will find a very long list of views. So we have reduction, emergence, pluralism, unity and disunity, physicalism, type and token identity, realization, weak and strong emergence, reductive and non-reductive physicalism, and the list goes on. So the plan today is to discuss and identify the main sources of disagreement in this particular debate, see whether these disagreements are actually insurmountable, and discuss whether this is something the philosophers should be worried about if this disagreement cannot be resolved. And I will conclude that, in fact, there will never be a wide consensus on inter-theory relations. Nevertheless, I will also point out that there are certain features within this debate about which philosophers can and should reach some partial reconciliation. Before I begin, I'd like to restrict my analysis. So I'm only going to consider views that have to do with relations between the natural sciences, so physics, chemistry, biology, and the theories that are subsumed within the relevant disciplines. And I'm also going to assume some minimal realism, in the sense that I take that those scientific theories are reliable sources of knowledge, and that there is a matter of fact about whether and what form relations are instantiated between scientific theories or between scientific entities. So let me start with the first part of my talk. Why are there so many different views? First, there are some innocent reasons, I call them. And they're innocent in the sense that they do not actually reflect genuine disagreement among philosophers, but rather explain why there are so many different views within this topic. So some of the reasons, the innocent reasons, are the following. So first of all, the question itself can be interpreted in many different ways, thus prompting and warranting different answers. So we have epistemic reading of the question. What are the relations between scientific theories? So for example, what's the relation between the ideal gas law and statistical mechanics? But there are also metaphysical interpretations. So one might focus on examining what's the relation between entities posited by certain theories. So what's the relation between genes and molecules, say? And all this prompts different answers, thus explaining the apparent disagreement within the literature. Another reason for a long list of views is that philosophers often focus on different areas of study. They look at different pairs of theories and how they are related, or at different phenomena in case studies and examples, or at even different scales within which certain phenomena occur. So all this prompts different views as well. Also, changes in science result in changing views about the relations, and philosophers continually get informed about scientific theories, and they get new insight on the nature about the nature of scientific theories and the different features of scientific practice, and all this prompts different views about inter-theory relations. However, there are also less innocent reasons why there is such a long list of views. And the first one is that comes from the fact that philosophers prioritize epistemic features of the sciences differently. So science is a complex theoretical and practical activity, which involves many different features and components. So there is the mathematical aspect, the construction of theories, the use of models and idealizations and approximations, background assumptions, but also historical evolution of theories and sociological factors as well. All these are features of the sciences, and philosophers do a lot of work in identifying which of these features are relevant to the discussion. Now, of course, this raises disagreement, not only about regarding whether we've identified the correct features, the most relevant ones to the discussion, but also disagreements about the evidential weight that should be assigned to different epistemic features. So, for example, compare unity without reduction with epistemic forms of pluralism. Often these accounts, even though contrary to each other in their main thesis, often those accounts identify similar epistemic features of the sciences, such as the fact that different pairs of theories employ partially distinct tools or different unique concepts and have different methodologies and experiments. Nevertheless, from the unity perspective, such features are not taken as decisive in identifying correctly the relation between the relevant theories. Whereas on the other hand, this unity thesis, such as epistemic forms of pluralism, take such features of the sciences to support pluralistic views. So we see that certain accounts, even when they identify similar features of the sciences, assign different evidential weight to them, thus prompting disagreement. Now, another thing that is relevant to the discussion has to do with the relation of science with philosophy. So when one investigates the epistemic relation of the sciences, how scientific theories relate to each other, it is quite uncontroversial that the relevant scientific theories and the sciences play a very important role in evaluating the relevant relations. However, when it comes to metaphysical readings of the relations, how scientific entities relate to each other, it is not uncontroversial how much science should play a role in the evaluation of metaphysical claims. And this has to do with a standard debate in the metaphysics of science, namely the debate between, broadly speaking, analytic metaphysics and naturalism, where analytic metaphysics takes that one should or at least can look beyond the sciences in order to make claims about the world. Naturalism takes science to be the ultimate guide to metaphysical claims. And obviously, this implies that each position and view has a different method of investigating metaphysical questions, including the question of how scientific entities relate to each other. So we see that disagreements are often prompted about the weight that should be assigned to scientific evidence when evaluating the tenability and coherence of a position. Now, another thing that prompts disagreement has to do with normative considerations that philosophers often have. Now, there are many normative considerations, but I will only focus here on two. So the first one concerns progress in science. How can progress be achieved? And philosophers often evaluate inter-theory relations on the basis of how their views on those relations can contribute to the progress of science. And obviously, philosophers disagree on what constitutes progress, thus adding to the multiplicity of views. For example, reductionists appeal to the values of simplicity, explanatory power, and universality in order to show that reductionism contributes to the progress of science. However, on the other hand, pluralists resist this and argue, in fact, that reductionism hinders the progress of science because it tends to rather exclude or delegitimize lines of investigation. So we see that this is a normative consideration that plays a very important role in evaluating certain views on inter-theory relations. And similarly, other normative considerations do the same. So, for example, Philosophers often evaluate positions about inter-theory relations on the basis of how these positions contribute to either supporting the primacy of physics or to supporting the autonomy of the special sciences. So, for example, certain philosophers wish to support the autonomy of the special sciences and explicitly argue that we should resist reductionism just because, or rather exactly because, reductionism undermines autonomy. So, for example, Lombardi and Lambarca in the philosophy of chemistry literature state that this traditional assumption of reduction not only deprives the philosophy of chemistry of legitimacy, but also counts against the autonomy of chemistry as a scientific discipline. Now, another thing, or rather the last thing I'll mention that prompts disagreement within philosophy has to do with existential considerations. So thinking about how the sciences relate inevitably draws us to consideration about our own nature as human beings. What are we made of? Are we only an aggregate of physical stuff? These are questions that crop up in the background of inter-theory relations. And indeed, initially, such questions were addressed in the context of religious debate. And this explains why positions were often associated with either theistic or atheistic views, with a characteristic example being materialism being associated with atheism. Currently, philosophers have attempted to secularize talk of inter-theory relations, and one will not find easily such explicit associations in the literature. Yet this does not mean that the existential worries are alleviated. Even when talk of inter-theory relations is completely dissociated from religious talk, the existential worry persists. It just takes a different form, the form of the hard problem of consciousness. Now, this is one of the most persistent issues in philosophy and represents perhaps the largest motivation behind any talk of inter-theory relations. Now, by this, I do not imply or suggest that in the literature that one will find in the literature of chemistry's relation with quantum mechanics or of thermodynamics relation with statistical mechanics any explicit mention of the hard problem of consciousness. Nevertheless, the results of such analysis inform one's views on the hard problem of consciousness and vice versa. And this is completely reasonable because the hard problem is the modern way people try to deal with their existential worries. And what do I mean by existential worries? Well, here I am referring to this very intuitive and personal issue that has to do with one's dealing with the fear of death and figuring out and understanding our existence as free and conscious human beings. Now, this is a very difficult issue, but it's open to very diverse psychological replies and has diverse psychological impact. Now, the important and the relevant here thing to note is that given the diverse psychological impact different answers to these existential issues can have, one should not expect that existential worries can be addressed in a collective and uniform manner, or even easily settled on an individual level. And as such, I take this to represent the most persistent source of disagreement about inter-theory relations. And this brings me to the next section about whether we should ever expect consensus. And I believe not. And I base this on Van Frazen's notion of stances. So Van Frazen, in his book, The Empirical Stance, talks about empiricism as a stance or a cluster of attitudes about what there is and about towards knowledge. And it's interesting because this idea of stances, it refers to the inclination and commitment philosophers often have towards certain epistemological, methodological, and ontological views. And that stances underwrite and motivate views on inter-theory relations is already evident by how certain positions. So, for example, materialism has been explicitly associated with a secular, anti-conservative, anti-clerical, and anti-mystical stance. And moreover, physicalism, Alyssa May argues, shouldn't be viewed as a position to be defended, but rather as a commitment to form one's ontology according to whatever physics says exists. So regarding inter-theory relations, it seems that each position within the debate is motivated by a specific stance. And that this is the case is evident by the sources of disagreement I mentioned earlier. So the methodological considerations about how science should be employed in support of metaphysical claims, the normative considerations about, among other things, progress and the autonomy of sciences, and more importantly, the existential considerations. Philosophers hold a very wide and diverse pool of views on these considerations. And it is these views that form different and unique stances towards inter-theory relations as well. Now, given that each position is motivated by a specific stance towards these issues, we should not expect that there will ever be agreement on inter-theory relations. And this is because stances do not admit to neutral adjudication or justification. And this is the case, especially if we take into account the existential worries that form part of one's stances. Even if one argues that philosophers could potentially find consensus on their normative and methodological considerations, I don't see any way in which philosophers will ever manage to reach consensus on their existential worries. And given that, and given the impact of existential worries on one's stances, I see no way in which one would ever be able to find agreement about inter-theory relations as well. Now, but should we be worried? This sounds like a grim result, but should we actually be worried if we never agree on inter-theory relations? Well, currently there is this view that agreement is not a requirement for progress in neither science nor philosophy, and that even though agreement is a standard of progress, there are other ways and other means by which we can achieve progress by, for example, developing a plurality of methods, views, values, or theories. And I do not want to resist that here. Nevertheless, I have two worries about this. The first one is an in-principle worry. If we assume that there is a matter of fact about how scientific entities relate to each other and about how scientific theories relate to each other, then it is surely worrying that we are unable to acquire knowledge of those relations, or rather to gain access to those relations. And this is something that, as Chalmers puts it in more general terms about philosophical disagreement, a quite disappointing reality. Now, of course, people could argue that this is a personal response and one need not be disappointed necessarily by philosophical disagreement. However, I think there's also a second pragmatic concern that we should take into account as well. And this is based on the fact that philosophy is an extrovert activity. Now more than ever, philosophers are required to show that their research projects produce results that are relevant and impactful, not only to philosophy itself, but to other areas of human activity. But how can we show philosophy's relevance if its work does not show any prospect for agreement? And this is particularly pressing if we take into account that agreement outside philosophy is commonly regarded as a sign of progress. So this is the second worry that I have. And so what is my proposal then, given all these grim results? Well, I've argued that there can never be consensus. However, there are certain features within this debate about which philosophers can and should find common ground, especially given those pragmatic considerations. And what are those features? First of all, we've already seen that philosophers converge at least about those positions that do not work. So, for example, strict Hegelian reduction or reduction as translation is widely accepted not to work with respect to special sciences. Also, there's a lot of work towards identifying and accepting that there are certain features of the sciences that play a very important role in identifying their relations. So, for example, scale has been shown that it is a very important feature of scientific theories, and identifying the scale within which a particular phenomenon occurs plays a very important role in correctly identifying the relevant relation. And this is something that philosophers have found common ground and agreed upon. Another thing that we should agree upon is the fact that science does play a very important role, both in the epistemic and the metaphysical reading of inter-theory relations. Because if we constrain the discussion only to the relations between entities that are posited by the sciences, then surely those sciences have to play some role in evaluating and discerning which positions are more plausible and which ones are not. So this is also something about which we can find common agreement. And the last thing about which we could find common agreement is about issues that seem to be stuck in too fine and unnecessary details. There are certain disagreements which are like disagreements between arguing whether a glass of water is half empty or half full. There's a similar situation in this debate as well sometimes, where you argue, for example, between unity without reduction and integrative pluralism. Now, it seems like there are substantial differences that warrant a debate between those views. However, if we look closer, the points of contact and overlap and the points in which those accounts agree are much more substantial and important than the fine details on which they disagree. And so instead of arguing whether the glass is half empty or half full, we should overcome such disagreements and just agree that in the case of the glass of water is both, in a sense. So all the above are ways in which we can reach partial collective agreement. And I think that's really important, especially considering the pragmatic considerations I mentioned before. Now, I'd like to conclude by putting here a poem, part of a poem, by Konstantinos Kavafis called Ithaca. And this is because the literature on, or rather the way in which philosophers investigate inter-theory relations reminds me a little bit of this poem, in the sense that just as Ulysses was in search of Ithaca, philosophers are often in search of the relations as well. And Kavafis here nicely says that it's not so much about reaching the island and expecting all these amazing things of the destination, but it's rather about the journey itself. All the value and the benefit is drawn from the journey. And I feel like the debate on inter-theory relations goes on in a similar way, in the sense that we do not care so much about reaching a consensus on what the relation actually is, but about reaping the benefits of doing this journey and debating different views. And of course, this is a very beautiful thing about doing philosophy, and I do not want to resist that. However, I feel that in certain respects, this has gone a bit too far, in the sense that we have forgotten that there is an actual island to look for. And we should be motivated by a sincere investigation of how and whether this relation actually exists. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my talk. I'm looking forward to your comments. And if you'd like to read my paper or see the references I've used, feel free to email me. And thank you very much.